Welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Jake Williams. Wanted to chat a little bit about the super micro hack. This is actually really, really interesting. I say hack. Maybe hack is not the right word. Actually, hack is not the right word. Hardware alleged. Let's go with alleged hardware backdoors. Right. Definitely the issue at hand. And wanted to kick out to those in the audience if you have any questions about stuff in general. That's kind of what I plan to do here. I have zero slides because it just happened this morning, and I'm busy with a bunch of other stuff. But we did answer questions for a couple of our clients already today, and we've answered some questions for another group folks as well. And I wanted to open it up maybe to the larger population a little bit. I know this is stuff that I'll say it's stuff that I know some of our clients are getting hit on. Given that, I expect it's stuff that you probably are getting hit on as well. And so wanted to just chat a little bit about the message overall about the hardware backdoors and how are we going to deal with those explicitly and what ultimately do we need to think about. So as we talk about all that stuff there, again, like I said, question mark is open here, and I'll kind of hit that. Want to do the quick 2-minute background here for those that haven't read the story yet. I can't imagine that you made it here, but cool. Alas, basically, there's a story in Bloomberg, which, by the way, is one of the worst sources when it comes to I have to respond to executives, right? Because executives read Bloomberg. So when it comes something in Bloomberg or the Wall Street Journal, those are. And when I said worst sources, I don't mean it's a bad source. What I mean is when that occurs, I always have the issue of, man, now I've got to deal with, or at least address with executives, the possibility of this stuff. Whereas if it's like in Wired or whatever, I tend to get off a little bit cleaner, right? There's not a lot of back and forth with that with that end. So anyway, one of the questions that I've got here in the chat is, do I see any wiggle room in the denials from Amazon and Apple? Well, look, as we cover the story here, probably worth noting that the Apple and Amazon have both flatly denied that they had any involvement. I believe Amazon's denial was pretty interesting. I don't see a lot of wiggle room in there other than the fact that Amazon came out specifically and said AWS. They weren't speaking for Amazon overall. But again, basically the article alleges that there are and have been hardware backdoors in the basically hardware backdoors in the Supermicro architecture and Supermicro motherboards specifically, right? And so basically they said, hey, we've got these or found these backdoors. These backdoors apparently are very, very small, on basically additional chips that have been added and to these motherboards, and they would allow basically the capability to go out and load other code into the kernel and run from there. And so one of the questions that I got is, do I see any wiggle room in the denials from Amazon and Apple? And I guess the short of it is, I don't know, right? It's really hard to say whether those denials are due to some national security letter, or you have to remember here that any of this would be any of these types of stories obviously would be covered by the FBI, and other intelligence community folks, and so I kind of step back then and wonder, is you can't hear or see anything? Well, that's kind of interesting. Can anybody hear or see anything? Maybe that's the. Yeah, it sounds great here. Okay, good to go. Somebody popped in and said, can you hear or see anything? I'm like, wow, okay, this would be very interesting. I'm talking to myself. Wow. Okay, no, apparently almost everybody else can. So whoever said can't hear or see anything, you're on your own there. I believe that's a volume problem on your end or something along those lines. Anyway, so coming back around, do I see anything in the denials? Yeah, I mean, I do, but at the same time, I kind of have to say, I have to take these with a grain of salt because, again, any of this would involve law enforcement and government intelligence services, right? And I can see that being, I could see people being muted or feeling like they needed to be, or any of that, right? So the way that the denials are worded are uncharacteristic. I will say that are uncharacteristic for organizations like Apple and Amazon. And I think it's going to be really interesting with Bloomberg, or with that whole that whole piece there, because Bloomberg has something that is sourced extensively. They mentioned 17 anonymous sources and sources that they said were basically granted anonymity because of the sensitivity or classified nature of what they were discussing. Right. So whether or not Bloomberg has all of the story correct, I think it is interesting to note that again, it is a very, very well-sourced story. And I'll mention this kind of on the front end here, since we're asking about the denials right up front. I'll mention that if it turns out that the story has significant errors, there's no question in my mind that there's going to be people that will nitpick as more of the truth comes out. And I'm sure that there's at least kernels of truth in the story. But if it comes out later that there are significant issues with the story for whatever reason, it's going to change the way that I feel like it should change the way national security reporting is done. There have been a couple of folks that have noted today already that a story of this magnitude maybe shouldn't have been reported with only anonymous sources. On the flip side, obviously they've been working on this for a while. I'll mention here too that as recently as June, as early as June, two people that I've chatted with outside of two people that I've chatted with outside of government have asked me specifically about Supermicro and what I felt about Supermicro. Now, at the time, I took both of those statements to be confusion. For these two independent people that asked me about this, I took that to be confusion about basically the fact that they have been Supermicro have been compromised earlier and were sending down malicious device drivers, and that was inappropriately referred to as a firmware hack earlier. That's stuff that I thought they were confusing it for. Although I'll be honest and say that now. I think this kind of takes on a whole new light, right? From where I sit, I'm kind of replaying those conversations now. Of course, I'm doing so with hindsight bias, right? I know that I have some hindsight bias playing in there, but alas, I think it's probably worth just mentioning there. Somebody asked, do I think it makes connections only over the IPMI or BMC interface? Can it possibly communicate with other network interfaces? I think the answer is that it can communicate over. I mean, first off, bottom line. Don't have any insight here, right? But any direct insight. But to come back and ask, if I were deploying a hardware implant, I wouldn't design it only to communicate over the IPMI interface. I think that would be very short-sighted. Let's assume for a moment the story is 100% true. Supermicro is indeed, basically using these devices that are backdoored. If I were designing one of these, I would not make it only able to communicate over IPMI. One of the things that's important to understand about IPMI, and for those that aren't familiar with that, it's IP Management Interface. It's what we typically call the lights out management. Some people call it ILO, or integrated lights out management. When I see ILO management, or some indications that it might have been in that space, that's certainly a place that I would want to put stuff. It makes perfect sense to put it in ILO, because ILO or IPMI allows you basically hardware access, right? You have DMA, direct memory access, which interestingly enough, by the way, totally dorks secure boot, right? So I've heard some people talking about secure boot, right, and how secure boot might be something that could help with this issue. Secure boot absolutely will not help you with this issue if you have a problem. Now, when people talk about secure boot, don't immediately be like, those morons, right? That's not the case, right? Now, look, a lot of times we would expect, secure boot to help. For instance, if somebody put down a bad firmware image, right? A bad EFI image, this is a spot where secure boot absolutely would help. If on the other hand, I actually am putting something in the hardware here now, basically secure boot is validating at boot time, at load time, that firmware image and ultimately that an operating system image is cryptographically unmodified, right? Basically hasn't been tampered with. But this is not what we're dealing with here at all, right? What you're seeing here is something that's a little bit different, right? So if we're talking about hardware, IPMI is a great place to put it. It doesn't just have to deal with IPMI, right? Obviously, from my IPMI interface, I can go in and I can press the power button. I can power on boot the machine. I can boot it out of off of a USB. I can do all kinds of crazy stuff with IPMI. And again, one of the things that it brings to bear is the ability to directly interrupt the processor, as well as to perform direct memory access, right? So on the main chipset itself. That is hugely concerning. Would allow you to do arbitrary read-write into kernel memory. I would expect at that point, if you were going to do something like that, I would expect that you would build shellcode for probably for Linux and Windows both, and given that it's server class hardware, and then have that ability to inject basically inject that shellcode into the kernel via the IPMI. That would then communicate out on the regular network interface. As long as they can get out to the network, then that's going to pull down that second stage or end stage malware. And so, again, without any knowledge on this, that seems like, again, if you're putting it in the how would I build stuff, that's it, right? I wouldn't put, when they talk about the tiny chips and the size of these chips, it would seem to involve, or seem to be, some folks have said, well, what could you possibly put on there? Well, I mean, the answer is definitely shellcode, right? I don't think you put an entire implant family on there. I think it's some tiny piece of shellcode that beacons out, download, execute, right? So that's kind of my gut there. Don't know for sure, but again, that's kind of where I would expect. And so to another question about IPMI, it says if you added an Ethernet or fiber card via PCI Express slot, could it communicate over that? I would expect so, given the access that IPMI has to the network. Right? So that seems pretty huge. Yeah, it says somebody notes, haven't been able to find anything specific about C2 servers. Are there rumors floating around about any specifics? No, and man, that is, I would love to see these. Regularly we talk about network monitoring. And when I work with cyber threat intelligence teams, one of the things that we like to talk about is the difference between discovery and detection, right? So detection, we talk about courses of action, right? Just to make sure, because those two seem a lot alike, but detection is I apply a signature and I'm looking for it from today going forward. And discovery is I'm actually looking, it's post hoc signature use. It's I've got the signature today. Did anything happen before today, before I had the signature? I know it's bad now. What happened 2 weeks ago that wouldn't have hit on my, let's say, my IDS, right? And so I think it's really interesting here about the list of, potential C2 servers. Were those, and very interestingly, were those domain names or were they IP addresses, right? Because one of the things that we've done a lot of work on looking for is something that we call DICs, direct IP connections, right? And so when I start looking at a direct IP connection, what I'm looking at here is I've got a NetFlow record, but I have no corresponding response from a DNS server. Well, that's kind of interesting because that means that whatever made that connection, right? Whatever made that connection then effectively didn't make a DNS server. And I'm noting here in the chat, I'm going to presume everybody can see that there, that Supermicro just kicked a press release out. I haven't read their press release, obviously, because I'm here. And again, I have no doubt that Supermicro is refuting these. Amazon and Apple have already refuted the claims in the story. Look, Supermicro's stock valuation got cut in half this morning, so I absolutely expect them to refute the allegations. But I think it is kind of interesting here, about these C2 servers. If we had a list of those C2 servers, whether they be IP addresses or whether they be domain names, what do we know about them, right? And it would seem that well, again, I mean, from where I sit, this seems like a pretty interesting case. Again, if we get those C2 servers, I think our big goal is not so much going to be detecting the malicious activity going forward, but it would be a lot of basically a lot of post hoc signature use in those cases. Now, one thing that I'm going to caution about here, kind of coming back to that question about C2 servers and do we have C2 servers or a list of them and all that, is that if and when that list gets released, and by the way, again, if this story has merit, I fully expect that to happen, right? At some point that list is going to be released. So if the story has merit, then I kind of look there and think, yeah, definitely going to happen. If it's released and you don't see any connections, but you have Supermicro hardware, does that mean the story is false, right? Well, I would say no, not at all. I think it's worth noting that, look, these folks spent a lot of money on this. Supposing this is true, I'm just going to capitulate. I'm going to stop saying supposing it's true. We'll capitulate for a moment that we believe it is true, right? Then if it's true, and by the way, from a technical perspective, everything about the story seems reasonably plausible. From a could we insert a hardware implant? Could that hardware implant, remain undetected? Could it? I think all that is plausible, right? So let's move past the is it technically plausible? It's technically plausible. Okay, so scroll forward here. Again, if we get those, I don't necessarily expect that all or even most server motherboards produced by Supermicro would have any of that backdoor capability built in. It's also possible that that again it may, depending on where that server lands, it's possible that they can send a kill signal back the first time it beacons that says, yeah, we're not interested in this one because of where it's at. Never call again, right? Or phone home 6 months from now, or whatever, right? So it may be the case that we get a list, right? Or again, it could be that your particular Supermicro motherboard was never impacted. So it could be we get this list, and I'll caution, very strongly here that just because we don't see any communication or even any attempted communication doesn't mean that others won't see that as well, right? So I think that's important to note. Second thing I want to note here is that in a hardware implant scenario, right, again, there's a massive amount of research and development that would have gone into this, not to mention the supply chain attack side of this, which, I mean, man, I just did a talk a few weeks ago on supply chain threat hunting with Sands. It was phenomenal, and kind of as I say, it was phenomenal. Like the response from that was pretty phenomenal. And I kind of stepped back and I wish that this story had been out then, right? Because it's sort of been a great thing to talk about on the whole supply chain side. We've had tons of supply chain, attacks kicking around here over the last few years. It's obviously an attack vector that that folks are looking at. I'd note that the Chinese were attributed to, or excuse me, the attack on CCleaner was attributed to China, right? The fact that the attack on CCleaner was attributed to China, that was a supply chain attack there as well. And it's obvious that supply chain, or that APT groups. Every time you say APT, God kills a kitten. But anyway, APT, right? These APT groups, particularly China, has already looked at supply chain attacks. That they also attacked Bit9 back in the day, if you recall. They were the ones that hit Bit9, trying to get to some of Bit9's customers. So from a TTP standpoint, this also makes sense, right? Now, granted, we're talking hardware versus software supply chain, but let's be clear, right? The supply chain piece is definitely supply chain thought is definitely there. I've got another question coming in. It says, how quickly would it take security research firms to be able to confirm evidence of the chip's physical existence? Yeah, so this is a great question, and I think I kind of already started touching on this with the how quickly will security researchers be able to confirm, right? Confirm is a heck of a lot harder than refute, because again, in this particular scenario, I want you to think about equities when you start thinking about an intelligence capability like this, because make no mistake about it, that's what this is. This is an intelligence capability. We're dealing at this point with somebody who has or basically a country that has a large budget for intelligence gathering, and they have invested what has to be tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in the research and development of such a backdoor, right? And so, let's say minimum tens of millions of dollars that they've spent in the research and development and getting into the supply chain, even targeting the correct organizations. That's obviously a very valuable asset. Now, in order to recoup your investment, you want to use this wherever there's a legitimate need. And at the same time, to protect the asset, you want to make sure you don't overuse it. Right? Frequently, people talk about risk decisions and intel gain loss decisions and all that. And so I think it's important to consider the fact that it's unlikely that this implant is everywhere. There's a Supermicro motherboard, even during those impacted times, right? So I would expect that whatever, again, the malware implant, backdoor chip, whatever we're calling it here, I would expect will not be on all chips. And so as a result, I don't know that it's going to be easy for security research firms to be able to confirm the evidence of the physical existence, right? So let's say, for instance, that that I buy 10 Supermicro servers off of eBay from various locations, various manufacture dates, etc. Just because I don't find any evidence of this on the chips, or sorry, those chips being on my devices that I buy, doesn't mean that again, that they don't exist on other devices, right? So that first and foremost, I think, is something we have to keep in the back of our minds, because over the next couple of days, I feel quite positive that you're going to hear a bunch of people come out and say, well, I looked at my Supermicro motherboard and I didn't find any extra chips. Well, that doesn't mean that they're not there. Secondarily, I think it's also important to note that that it need not be an additional chip that gets placed onto the motherboard. It could be any number of other chips that are already there that, by the way, let me note, are also by and large manufactured in China, right? And so, and I'm not playing the whole nationalist, oh my gosh, China, scary kind of thing here, but I think it is important to know there that, again, the majority of the chips that we deal with today are are coming out of China in the first place, and as a result of that, that we have that it could very well be the case. You could examine your motherboard, and every chip that Supermicro documents is supposed to be there is there. It shows the right model number, etc., and still has a backdoor in it, right? As an InfoSec researcher, I don't have the capability to be able to go in and check a server and say, and I've actually done a fair amount of hardware work over the years. I can't open up a server myself and say, yep, this one's good, right? There's way too much in there. I mean, we could, over a period of quite some time, look for and examine, and I mean, we would need X-ray equipment and a lot of equipment that I personally don't have, here, and that most InfoSec firms I don't think have on hand, to be able to verify silicon paths and whatnot, and largely would be a destructive technique to be conclusive, right? So again, I want to kind of point out here that proving the negative is going to be, well, proving the negative is always logically impossible, but take that out for a minute here. Proving that this is not a thing is something that's not going to be easy for InfoSec researchers. Proving it is a thing, on the other hand, is something that I think is going to be a little bit easier. Understanding, of course, that the number of places that these would have been deployed, I think, is pretty low relative to your overall number. And I want you to think about, why would you ever deploy one of these in the first place, when we all know that our users open up emails for free iPods, right? It's like, hey, want a free iPod? And they're like, click, click, click. And it seems like can't click fast enough, right? If that's the case, and by the way, I'm not user shaming here. Let's just call a spade, right? If you do pen testing or red teaming, and we certainly do at Rendition, we know that our click-through rate is phenomenal on malicious attachments. So why would China resort to this kind of thing, or any nation state resort to this kind of thing? And I think the answer is, you're going after hard targets that you don't have sustained access to, right? And so if I'm thinking about Amazon and Apple, I mean, I'm kind of stepping back there and wondering, like, are those the targets that I'd be going after here, given that kind of attack? Now, I don't know about Amazon's security or Apple's security. I'm thinking it's pretty good, but they're also big organizations, right? And it just takes one person slipping up. I mean, who knows at the end of the day, right? I will mention that it's a heck of a lot harder to go find something inside like this. It's a lot like chasing down an insider attack. Even if I watch and I catch lateral movement and I back up, and as a forensic investigator, think about this for a minute. You drop onto a server and you're like, what's here? I got all the way back here, and you're like, and basically then what you find is malware magically appeared, right? I mean, I'm kind of having one of those like mind blown moments, but that really is it. All right, so how quickly is it going to be or how quickly we're going to see stuff from security researchers? I don't know. I think that's tough, right? I've got another question that says, are there actions that firms should be taking now, or people should be taking now, regarding deployed Supermicros? Is it better to wait for more information? That's actually kind of the crux of what I've been talking to clients about this morning, right? And that is that, this morning and this afternoon, and that's that I don't have good, solid advice for what you should be doing right now. My gut says if you've got a bunch of deployed Supermicro servers, I would largely say that maybe state of heightened vigilance, but realistically, I don't know where to tell you to move. I certainly haven't recommended that anybody start ripping them out of racks or powering them off or any of that. Now, before somebody says heightened vigilance, that's ridiculous. I want you to consider for a moment here that as of a few hours ago, the story broke at Bloomberg, right? And this really marks largely the end of the Chinese workday, when the story broke early this morning, going into to overnight in China. Now granted, it doesn't matter. These are military organizations. They largely work, nights anyway, or will work nights anyway. But I do think it's important to note. That they largely have probably started acting on, or maybe acting on, right? Obviously, there's a risk decision. In fact, I tweeted out a question about this earlier today. If you're China and you've spent all that money on these, basically on this capability, and you wake up this morning or whatever, you see this Bloomberg article and you find out the capability is gone, right? Or out of the bag. The cat's out of the bag. What do you do with it, right? Do you use it now? Do you press forward now, knowing that people are watching, right? So supposing that the article is 100% true, We don't have the list of C2 domains, but again, if the article is true, U.S. intelligence does, right? Domains, IP addresses, whatever that is, right? U.S. intelligence certainly does, right? So again, are you playing the game now? Now, look, China traditionally has not been big on the whole, attribution piece. They haven't worried as much about stuff being attributed to them, but again, who knows, right? At the end of the day, I would want, if I've got super micro hardware, I am actually doing a little bit more vigilance. And I would probably at least temporarily, right? If I've got, let's say, yeah, and again, a lot of my recommendation here is going to depend on your maturity level in your organization, your instrumentation. I would say another big one is what's your population density of super micro hardware, right? If you presumably, if most of what your stuff is not super micro, but you've got like 5 servers outlying there and you got a high maturity shop, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and add those 5 servers to my watch list a little bit more, right? And again, only because I don't know, I don't know how China's going to react to this. Again, assuming it's a real thing, how are they going to react? Are they going to, basically be like, man, we better use this stuff before that C2, list comes out and becomes public, knowing that U.S. intelligence is watching, right? Then, or they're like, whew, that's toxic, never touch that again, right? Now, I kind of have an idea about how some organizations, might handle this. I would probably talk differently about, if this is like a hacking team op or a, Corrado or whatever. But China typically is, they've been pretty reckless when it comes to, when it comes to attribution. And, again, Chinese government's already flatly denied this too. So, I mean, who knows at the end of the day. But I guess at the end, as I look at this, network monitoring is key, and it always has been key. And it was interesting. I reread we published a meltdown inspector action plan back in January, and I reread that today. And one of the things that it mentioned was network monitoring, because it is so hard to find this stuff on the endpoint. And I've had some other folks where they're like, well, you want to do other monitoring. Network monitoring is only part of the picture. My follow-up question is, where else are you monitoring that's going to pick this up, right? Because from where I sit, it's network and network only. My endpoint detection, my antivirus suites, there's 0%. Even if they're injecting malicious code into memory in the kernel, I'm going to rate with a roughly 0% chance they ever pick that up because of how it's being inserted. I'm just not buying that. Now, they may pick up the second stage or end stage stuff that gets put down, but again, I don't picture them grabbing the malware directly. So what should you do? I would say maybe increased vigilance, particularly if you know you have these in the environment. One thing to mention here is that you may not know you have them in the environment. Supermicro motherboards are in a ton of other hardware, a ton of other vendors' hardware. And so even if it doesn't say Supermicro on the chassis, it could be Supermicro regardless, right? So I got another question here. Wouldn't proper ACLs and firewall controls mitigate this backdoor? Yeah, definitely. There's no question that, particularly in a server environment, particularly in a server environment, you want a deny all permit by exception, right? Kind of ACLs there, right? So if that's you, and again, look, at the end of the day, I'm not an idiot. And I heard people, a couple of network admin people going, "I told you so," and 2 other people, in the background screaming, "It's not that easy." As I said, you should have deny all permit by exception. I'm under no illusions about how difficult it is. I'm under no illusions about the resources that it requires to do that. But at the end of the day, this is yet another case where, again, good ACLs and good firewalling would have mitigated this kind of problem, would have mitigated a backdoor that has to call out and grab other code, right? And separately from that, let's not just talk about mitigation, let's talk about detection, right? Because if you detect it and then you go back to the server and maybe at some point you're like, forget it, we're just going to wipe the drive and reload, and then it happens again anyway. Don't you really step back and take a harder look at that? And heck, maybe that's how, again, presuming that the story is correct and Apple and Amazon, detected this, did Apple figure it out because of something like that? All right. At the end of the day, I don't know. I've got another question here. Is it possible that the AWS Apple people involved were told by the Intel community any information is classified and they can't talk to anybody about at their company about those capabilities? Therefore, the denials are genuine because any information was tightly constrained. Yeah, I've actually kind of theorized a little bit about that. Now, I have very little doubt that over the last let's say 6 hours, right? At least, probably a little bit longer. At Amazon and Apple, there have been some email blasts going out like that. Hey, if you know anything about this, regardless of what you're told by anybody else, call us, right? Kind of thing. Contact us. Let us know that this is something that's. Let us know this is something that's a thing, that you at least have knowledge of this, right? And so I have little doubt that that's occurring. But to your question, is it possible that the information was tightly held? Yeah, I would absolutely expect that, and I would expect that anybody involved would have been read the Riot Act by the U.S. government, right? And possibly up to and including, some type of federal gag order or all that. Somebody asked, would a national security letter cover companies who issued firm denials from legal repercussions? I am not a lawyer, so the short answer is I don't know. I don't know. And in fact, I don't know specifically if the NSL legal framework would even stop somebody from, or would allow the government, give the government the legal framework to prevent people from talking about this. I'm sure that there is a legal instrument. I have no doubt that there is a legal instrument that allows the U.S. government to gag or compel folks not to talk about an active investigation of national security importance, and this certainly would fit that description, right? Certainly fit that description. So the short of it is, I don't know if an NSL covers that or not, right? But I do think, and I'll happily take more questions if this is, if anybody has any more. But otherwise, I'll start to sum some stuff up here and say that this story is absolutely groundbreaking, right? It's the kind of thing that we constantly. Look, there's those of us in the industry who some people find to be paranoid or whatever, and like, but look, man, they're not paranoid. It's not paranoia if they're really out to get you. And I have to note that it's entirely plausible that the story is real. If the story is not real, right? If there's any significant deviation from the facts, right? In this story, it is going to change the way national security reporting is performed. Because again, right now, and I think about all these stories that I've seen, from Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and you name it, right? Where they're relying on, anonymous sources speaking on condition of anonymity. Very often, that's because they're talking about stuff that's, well, just like this case, right? Sensitive or classified, but that there's obviously a public interest in knowing, right? And I kind of step back and I think about a lot of that, and I wonder how this is going to change national security reporting if indeed it's found that that Bloomberg dropped the ball on correctly reporting this. My gut says with 17 people involved, with 17 different sources involved, as well as the fact that I would expect Bloomberg to have red teamed this pretty extensively internally. If you're not familiar with the red team term when it comes to journalism, this is something that journalists do quite a bit. They will intentionally hold out when working on a major story. They'll intentionally hold out some number of editors and other journalists from even hearing about the story until they're done with it. Basically, they'll keep them in the dark on any details. Like, it's obvious there's a big story brewing, but they're held out specifically to red team the story. And the idea is, before it goes to press, before they fire it up and get it ready, basically the reporters, as they've gathered up their facts and they've written out kind of the framework of their story, they'll lay it out to these other journalists and editors, and those folks will then come in and try to poke holes in it specifically and say, okay, well, here's a hole, here's a problem, here's your sourcing is bad, or maybe you want to get another source to firm this up, or you name it, right? And I can't fathom that Bloomberg hasn't done this. Now, if they have, if they didn't red team for whatever reason a story of this magnitude, man, I mean, just journalistic integrity for the whole publication is out the window. It's not just those two reporters. I think it's for the whole, the whole publication. I think is they're put in jeopardy here. So and the editors know this, right? And so I again, it's hard for me to get to the point of thinking that the story is 100% fake. I feel like there's probably a kernel of truth there, given the number of sources that they claim to have. And again, whether or not we know the sources, bear in mind that the editors know the sources in most cases. I would expect that many of the folks that were dealing with those, dealing with the red team, probably learned the identity of some, if not all, of the sources. So I think that's pretty significant. The second thing that I want to mention here kind of comes back to the whole, what do you need to do today? The answer is, be aware, be maybe a little bit hyper vigilant if you've got the stuff in the network. If you don't, be hyper vigilant anyway, because as we kind of talk about this, well, a couple of things. Again, one, you don't necessarily know just based on the model, or make or model of the server, whether or not it has a Supermicro motherboard. Bear in mind that, if this is real, and again, I'm capitulating that it is, the Chinese government just lost a significant capability. And they then have to turn around and make a decision about what they're going to do with that capability. It's also important to remember that it may not just be Supermicro. Right. Again, most of our hardware is manufactured over in China. So even if you were going to pull the plug and move somewhere else, where would you move to? Right. Somebody asked me earlier today about the cloud. Right. What about AWS? And I said, look, at worst, first off, Amazon at least has some control over their supply chain, like real control over their supply chain. And in fact, actually build a lot of their own or commission a lot of their own servers for a lot of their high density server farms. Well, okay. I mean, that plus Amazon, according to the story anyway, even though they've outright denied it elsewhere in the press, according to the story, had some insight on this already, right? Well, if nothing else, I mean, that makes Amazon someplace I want to stay. They're big enough that they would have been warned by the government if that were really happening. They're also, again, they've also got a pretty good handle on security, and so. Where am I going to move? Really would be my question if you're thinking about making a move, right? I just saw the question pop in too. What's the likelihood that more vendor hardware, hasn't been implanted? If it's possible Supermicro was hit, is it possible there are others that we just haven't found? Oh yeah, I mean 100%. I think that again, if you're talking about Supermicro today, what should we be talking about tomorrow, right? Because that's a huge question. Well, look, Lenovo is kind of funny to joke about there, but there's been a lot of allegations about Lenovo hardware in the past, and so I mean that's look, at the end of the day, we talk about supply chain a lot, but China's part of our threat model for a lot of us, right? The Chinese government's part of our threat model, and the hardware that we're putting into our networks is largely manufactured. Some active component of the hardware in most cases is passing through China, right? I mean, is controlled or manufactured by China, and as we know in China, there's a lot less of a separation between commercial and government, right? So I'll kind of close. Wonder if the publishing of this article now makes Bloomberg more of a target the reporters and the editors to figure out the identity of the sources. I'm sure it does. That's a really interesting point, man. I had not thought about anybody targeting Bloomberg directly as a result to try to find out who the sources are. But yeah, I mean, look, why wouldn't you, right? I guess is kind of the be all end all. Journalists are, I'm going to note, probably a little bit more cybersecurity, particularly the folks that work on NatSec reporting, are probably a little bit more cybersecurity conscious than most folks out there. So there's that. But yeah, it's really interesting to think about that. I'm sure it does open up those two reporters and the editors and others around them probably to increase risk of cyber attack. I guess kind of as I'm closing out here, I'm noting here some folks asking about network switches and firewalls, and yeah, I mean, again, just remember it's the vast majority of that stuff is either manufactured in or is passing through China, and bear in mind too that when we do. Anytime a manufacturer does an audit to say, hey, what if, basically when they do an audit to say, hey, is there a backdoor here? Remember that a lot of that's destructive to be able to fully determine that. Involves X-rays, involves, in some cases, electron microscopes. And again, in those cases, you're actually pulling polymer off the silicon, and it's a nasty process. It's not easy. It's very, very expensive, and remember too, it's sampling. It's not 100%, right? So not 100% of those servers will be, and that's how you beat that that sampling is you don't implant 100% in the first place. I'll also note that Amazon and Apple are big targets, right? Those two that were mentioned, there were supposedly 30 targets that were identified. But when you think about the, Amazon and Apple, having been targets, bear in mind that they're not ordering one server at a time, they're ordering thousands, right? Hundreds or thousands of servers at a time. So they don't need to necessarily implant, 1,000 of those servers. They just have to pop a couple of them, right? And so, then you're reducing the risk that even if people are sampling out of that batch, right, which they're not, but if they were, what are they really going to notice, right? So I think that's pretty huge here. I've got a question about why can't the electronics manufacturing process come to the U.S. or another country? The process is mostly automated. What's the cost savings in going through China? It's environmental. So I'm not an expert in this 100%. I've been in a clean room or two in my day. I mentioned I've done a little bit of hardware work in the past, but I'm pretty sure the majority of, and feel free, by the way, if somebody knows better than I do, feel free to jump in here and correct me. But I believe the large, it's not labor cost, it's largely environmental cost that keep China. You may have remembered from the Olympics a few years ago when it was over in Beijing. Where they were talking about, basically spinning down factories ahead of the Olympics to improve air quality, right? Like they were worried about marathoners getting out there and running in the smog kind of thing. And so, and there have been some great pieces recently on exposing, some of these like toxic lakes that have, sprung up with the toxic lakes that have sprung up here. So yeah, somebody asked here if this thing's recorded afterwards. Yeah, totally. I'm recording the whole thing. I'll publish to YouTube as soon as we go offline. I mean, as soon as possible after we go offline. Obviously, I got to download it and then it's got to go up to YouTube and all. Yeah. Anyway, but yeah, we're definitely recording this. But basically, some of the toxic lakes and whatnot. These folks just don't deal with environmental regulations the way we do. There's a lot of chemicals involved in building these chips. I suspect that's why the majority of that processing is still over in China. And also there's a momentum thing, right? At the end of the day, there's tooling that has to happen here. There's you talk about like Foxconn. I don't know if anybody remembers Foxconn, where they were doing like some of the surface mount chips and whatnot. They had there was a big expose a while back about suicide nets at the factories, like meaning in the dormitories where the people that work the factories, work there, the working conditions and living conditions were so bad that people were committing suicide by jumping out of the windows at such a rate that they put suicide nets in place, which I mean is like this mind-blowing thing from an American standpoint to think about, right? So I suspect that there's a lot of factors that play in, but I don't think labor is the real reason that we're not manufacturing here. I believe it's environmental. I'm sure labor plays a piece in it though. Somebody mentioned in China, any manufacturer would be glad to help the government and get political points in return. I've never been to China, right? And at this point in my life, pretty sure I'm never going to China. So I don't know, right? In China, any manufacturer could be glad to help. Again, that's one of those things that stands to reason for me, but I don't know the truth to it. I note here as well that somebody mentions I'm waiting for all of the blockchain could have prevented this. Yeah, you know what? Let's hit that up. That is a great spot to great thing to hit here, because there are going to be snake oil salespeople out there very quickly talking about blockchain, right? And how blockchain could have secured our supply chain. Now, I'm going to stop it right there, right? And I want to analogize here very quickly with, Walmart is using IBM's blockchain technology to track its produce, right? So produce that goes to the goes to the stores, and they claim that in the event of a recall scenario, it'll be very quick for them. They can do it in seconds rather than taking days to go back through records and try to find where all the produce from a particular processing plant or crop or whatever was at. But let's be clear about this. Anything on the blockchain is only as good as, I mean, honestly, it's only as good as the data entry, right? And by the way, too, I find it hilarious that as they talk about how great the blockchain is, and don't worry, we've got all this data here. They're not even by the way, when you talk about blockchain, one of the big things about it is all about the decentralization. This is actually going back to IBM, right? So that's the hilarious part about it, is all these vendors, right, are actually the vendors, the suppliers, right, are basically inputting data into an app that's writing it on the IBM's blockchain services, right? So I'm mystified as to why that somehow is better than just a regular centralized database. But I want to note here that, again, there's nothing about blockchain or any other, and I want to be clear about this, any other supply chain reporting mechanism that would prevent this kind of attack or even offer any certainty against this kind of attack, right? Here, what's effectively happening is that you have, let's say, insiders. And again, I think it's worth mentioning, Supermicro themselves may not even be aware that this is occurring, right? Again, supposing it's occurring, they may not be aware it's occurring. This literally could be a number of one or a number of intelligence agents working at a Supermicro plant, or people co-opted by them, who are then putting these chips in place, right? So yeah, I think that's hugely hugely important. It's also worth mentioning that just because this stuff gets manufactured in China doesn't mean that somebody else isn't also doing it, right? Meaning it could be another nation-state intelligence organization. Suppose the chips are real, right? Again, there's no data in the story that says it's the Chinese government. Although, again, I suspect that's being shared by that theory, confirmation, whatever is being shared by some of those anonymous sources, right? Yeah, somebody notes, again, there must be some indications of compromise in terms of inbound and outbound network traffic. And yes, that's the key, right? Network traffic for the win. That's the one place you're getting visibility. Now, again, you're looking for a needle in a haystack, right? And it's a small needle, a very, very small needle in a ridiculously large haystack that's getting bigger every day, right? Nobody's network traffic volume is going down. Everybody's is going up. I think that's a big deal. One thing I want to mention here, and I'll close with this point, unless there's more questions, but I think that this is probably one of the biggest takeaways here, and it has nothing to do with Supermicro. If you're running, right, if you're running a fire drill today because of this, you need to step back and ask, how have you architected your network? How have you architected your defenses? How have you architected your detection strategies? Because this shouldn't be a fire drill event, right? It should be something that management is asking about. There's no question, right? It should be something management is asking about. And we as InfoSec professionals, if we've done a good job architecting our network, and again, I know it's not always in our ability, or within our ability to dictate this is how we're going to architect, this is how we're going to do. I get it, right? But again, I want to mention here that if this is a fire drill event for you, if this is going to keep you up at night, ask yourself because this is not going to be the only time we run this fire drill, right? Ask yourself, what can you do today, right, to make things better for the next one, right? Because I think that's my big takeaway. And I say this because, and I'm going to, I'll post the link here in chat, but I want to note here that when we looked at Spectre and Meltdown, I posted an action plan there, an enterprise action plan. And it's basically just 6 steps, right? And it's not specific to, posted the link there in the chat. It's not specific to this. It says, hey, step up your monitoring plan, right? I talked about reconsidering cohabitation of data with different protection requirements, right? I think this is yet again plays out there, right? Again, if I'm right about this, and it's not 100% of Supermicro servers, but it's some small percentage of that are being implanted. I think that's important, right? To look at your different protection requirements and segmenting that off. Network segmentation for the win, right? Said take a look at procurement and refresh intervals as well as change management procedures. I think that's also important, right? Examine the security for hosted applications. Yep. Again, this is another spot where you got to ask, where are my hosted applications? What security measures are being taken around those, right? Because again, here we've got another one of these, let's say God level or God mode level potential compromises, right? And so now you have to step back and say, okay, my security monitoring is good, but that hosted application that's sitting out, and whether it's in Salesforce or O365 or AWS, right? What are they doing for their security, right? So I'm worried about that. And then number 6 in my original 6-step action plan from January 4th, right, is is have an executive communications plan. If you have one, you've probably used it today, right? And in fact, they may be using it with you as we speak, or have earlier. But I think, you know, have an executive communications plan has aged really, really well. Step up your monitoring plan, aged really, really well. Cohabitation, I think, good there also. Some of the other stuff, you know, is okay, but not necessarily, or not as applicable to this specific scenario. But again, I think it, you know, just coming back around full circle, I think it's important that, you know, that we think about, you know, in the context, or think about the context of how are we going to deal with, you know, how are we going to deal with the next one of these that comes around. And I think if you've got good solid monitoring in place, you know, good segmentation in place, and good change management procedures, and you know what your documentation looks like. And I see somebody noting here, documentation is always out of date. Yeah, I know, man. And it's, look, that's something we always deal with, but you can't let perfect stand in the way of good enough, right? Regularly, I get people who are like, there's no way we'll get 100% on this. I'm like, fine, let's do 95%. Because we all agree intuitively 95% is better than 5 or 0 or whatever. Look, you know, it's always a resourcing question. We can only do the best we can do. But again, you know, I kind of implore you on the back end here, as the story continues to evolve, think about what your monitoring plan is. Think about what your, you know, what your segmentation, network segmentation plan is. You know, because look, a lot of the stuff that you're dealing with today, even if management's like, don't worry about this, right? Maybe they believe the Bloomberg story is fake. Maybe they, who knows, whatever. I don't care. I absolutely want you to be thinking about how you're going to deal with the next one of these, because that's going to be the problem, right? If you've got the network segmentation in place, you've got the, you know, the firewalling in place, the ACLs in place, the, you know, monitoring DNS in place, good documentation on what you have where. I really think this is where you're gonna win in the long run, right? A good friend of mine, CISO at a yeah, somebody mentions gather network traffic samples to baseline activity. Yeah, and look, you'll have people that tell you that baselining doesn't work when the attacker is already in the network, right? And here, you know, should we even bother? And the answer is yes, absolutely, we should bother. We should absolutely be gathering network traffic samples, right? Because again, who knows, you know, what else you're going to pick up? Because tomorrow it may not be this. Tomorrow it may be, you know, oh no, look out because there's this other new O-Day vulnerability. Let's just say in Java, right, or struts, right? Since that seems to be the whipping boy of the week. You know, if that's the case, and somebody's been actively exploiting it for a few days, wouldn't you want to be able to go back and say, yep, that wasn't on our baseline a few days ago, but it is now, right? And we can see then the change and detect those attacks. So yeah, I should absolutely be baselining activity, but I think beyond just the normal baselining, I think a lot of this is mitigated by building a secure, defensible architecture. Yeah, I think this is going to be a fascinating story to watch emerge. By the way, I appreciate all your time today as well. I know we're busy. I know we've got a lot of stuff going on, but you know, I got so many questions about this from so many different people coming in, you know, our customers and others alike. I figured that we'd spend a couple of minutes here and put this out for the broader community. So I appreciate all the questions. Hopefully this has helped and gives you something you go back to management with. And anyway, so thanks everybody. With that, peace out, and yeah, enjoy.